Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out today and watching this webinar. It should be pretty entertaining. And with that, I'd like to hand over the presentation to Wolfgang Gorlick.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for that introduction, Matt. Thanks everyone for joining. So what we're talking about today is social engineering, right? So oftentimes organizations get breached by the human level, right? So if you look at OSI, I'm on that top stack. That's how they're getting in. And what sparked off this webinar was some conversation I had with Sean, who I'm going to introduce in just a second. And he was telling me all these great war stories, and I was wincing because I came from a spot where I was trying to keep people like Sean out. And we started going back and forth. I'm like, well, if you did this, I do that. He's like, well, if you did this, I do that. I'm like, well, if you did this, then I burn down my building on a stack. I give up. So with that, over to you, Sean.
Thanks for the warm introduction there, Wolf. As Wolf mentioned, I'm the assessment practice manager here at CBI. I've been in the organization for about 13 years. I've been in information security for longer. Don't want to date myself too much. I got 15 years up there, thank you. And I do lead a lot of our social engineering and other red team exercises. And as Matt and Wolf both alluded to, we're going to have some really exciting stories for you here today.
I'm glad you're the old guy, right? So as I go to the next slide, it's like 20 years in IT, 10 years in IT security. Thanks so much for that. So as Sean teed up, he plays the offense. He does these red team assessments day in and day out. My role as a strategist at CBI is sitting down with security leaders, understanding what threats they're trying to face, bringing in some of the insight from people like Sean and from our threat intel groups, and figuring out how we can build a good defense. And so as we go back and forth, Sean will play offense, I'll play defense, and we'll highlight some areas in addition to the great stories from Sean that you guys can apply in your realm, in your organizations to prevent the social engineering attacks from happening. And with that, the agenda is pretty straightforward. We're going to look at health insurance. We're going to look at the time where CBI was tasked with getting the plans, intellectual property from research development. How about the times we're going after a teller and you end up in a bank vault, or when you're flying and you're looking at airports and hopping around from different networks to different networks. And of course, I'm sure there's a few stories where Sean took a selfie in the data center. Now, he actually did take a selfie in my data center when I was a security manager. No joke. I'm still not over that.
So health insurance, yes. So what I want to talk here is what we're going to do is we're going to go over a series of different campaigns that we've successfully, and in some cases unsuccessfully, leveraged in the past. And we're going to talk as far as what the objective was, what our attack mechanisms were, and then what the outcome was. So what we want to do here is start off with the health insurance perspective. And what I want to allude to here is around this time of year, October, November, December, we are very well in tune with some of the different campaigns from a social engineering perspective that work based on some seasonal attribute. Well, health insurance is one that we've had a lot of success with over the years, and for the right reasons. Health insurance is near and dear to most every organization and employee that we deal with. It's part of their family's livelihood and well-being, so it's something that we've capitalized on. So what we do as far as an objective, the objective of this campaign specifically is to get a user to click on a malicious link URL that may direct them to a site that's got some malicious JavaScript running or maybe install a backdoor of some sort. But the goal is really to convince that user to click on the link. And the way that we do that is as you'll find the recurring theme here, is all about research and reconnaissance. So the first thing we do is we research the organization, identify what the specific attack vector should be, and then we build an email that looks like it has something to do with the open enrollment of the health insurance program for 2016. So usually all organizations get some open enrollment communications going. And what we do is, first of all, we go out and we usually purchase a domain that looks similar to the organization's domain that we're attacking. And then we identify what insurance provider it is that they're using. And that's actually easier than you might imagine. One of the most beneficial ways we find out who their health insurance provider is generally just job postings. You go out there, you can see some information. Oh, Blue Cross Blue Shield is our health insurance provider, and here's our dental provider. And in the cases where that doesn't work, I usually just call up the organization based on some job posting that's out there and ask them a few candid questions, and I throw in there, well, by the way, I'm very interested in what your health insurance profile is. So please, is it Blue Cross Blue Shield, or is it, Aetna, whatever. So that's an easy perspective. And then lastly, as part of the research, we have to impersonate an individual. All right. So through different reconnaissance techniques, LinkedIn, all sorts of different open source intelligence mechanisms, we usually identify easily the human resources department, manager, executives, and those are the individuals that we're going to impersonate by leveraging this attack strategy. So what we do is usually most of the cases, I put together some either survey, like I'll go out to SurveyMonkey and build some survey that says, what did you think of our program last year? What could we do to improve on the program next year? And then here are some of the things that we're thinking about including into the health insurance program for next year. What do you think? All of these questions are irrelevant. All I need is the user to click on this malicious URL. But what we're doing is building a very solid driver for those targets to click on that link. Now, the reason we're telling this health insurance program is because of our track record over the years in executing this very same campaign. 50 to 80% success rate is what we're generally seeing when we launch this campaign against users or organizations that have never ran this campaign before, or in some cases haven't done social engineering before. It's very successful, and for all the right reasons, right? Because this is, again, near and dear to my heart as an employee. I have a commitment to making sure my family's well-being is intact, and that usually is a direct extension to the health insurance program. So really easy to convince those users to click on that link. In most cases, like I mentioned, we have that 50 to 80% success rate.
And there's time pressure too, right? So during this open enrollment, you're hearing you've got to get the information, you got to get the information. Please reply. If you don't reply, you don't have health insurance. So you got the zeitgeist of the moment. Everyone's jumping in and looking at this information. You got the time pressure. So one of the examples you ran recently that you're telling them about looked like SurveyMonkey, if I recall correctly. So like duplicated SurveyMonkey, had the right information that you had snarfed out by calling in, sent to all the people. So my question is, in addition to this report, did you like tell them what the employees were saying? Like, oh, you really should add this.
Based on some of the different techniques we use, sometimes we use a malicious JavaScript inside of a web browser to do this, so we can see everything that they type in. And in some cases, yeah, I've had to go to the CIO and I have to tell them, yeah, this is what your users really think of your health insurance program. Not sure if I want to share some of this with you or not. They're very direct in some of their cases, but yeah, that's most certainly a very likely outcome from some of the data that we collect as a result of that engagement.
Yeah, and that's one of the things too that concerns me is once you got that JavaScript running and they're on that page, of course, not only are you typing in or capturing what they type in into that user form, but you're capturing full keystrokes. So I recall in some other assessments that you're actually able to capture creds and everything else if they leave that browser window open.
That's right. One of the tools that we use is called the Browser Exploitation Framework. It's called BEEF for short, and it's extremely good at taking all those different controls and countermeasures that we've usually had to alleviate or traverse through and taking them right out of the equation, right? So it's great to be able to target a mobile device, whether you're in iOS or Android or whatever, or Windows, Mac, Linux, doesn't matter. BEEF is the Browser Exploitation Framework is pretty independent as far as who it targets. And again, one of those really good modules or capabilities that we have within this technology is we can run certain processes or certain malicious processes against that user's browser session themselves. So sometimes we'll just pop up a little window as they're browsing that says, enter in your network credentials. And we just conducted this last week for an engagement, and we had about 45% of the users actually enter in their network credentials. And this after they had just gone through a very rigorous security awareness training program the week before, apparently. So great success.
So, of course, the control is to do security awareness programs. One of the things I like about these types of assessments and whatnot is you do the training, but what's the control for the training, right? Who's watching that? And the ability to say, hey, don't click on links. And then you run the training. And then, oh, by the way, you really clicked on links is a great way to get true feedback as to how well that training is going, as well as fostering a better culture of security. So some defensive controls. One of the things I like to think about is anti-lock brakes. How do we keep people out of trouble? Some things you can do there. You can do spam filtering, obviously, looking for heuristics that's going to weed out some of these emails. Dedicated attackers will still get in. URL whitelisting on the proxy is another way that you could do it. So you mentioned doing type squatting. You could just whitelist the URLs that people should go to for businesses. Not always easy, but depends on the environment. So, more static environment, you can do that. Another way to do this is on the DNS side. So, what I've started seeing is organizations using providers like OpenDNS to look for those malicious URLs, to report on them, and then just black hole it. It goes to a local host, or it goes to another website that reports back to the security team that someone's been breached, and back to the user that, hey, something has gone wrong here. And on the driver's training side, okay, so you got your interlock breaks to keep people out of trouble. You got the driver's training to make sure they don't run into oncoming traffic. Routine phishing exercises is probably the best way to do this. Continuously testing people and making sure they're aware of it. It's one thing to give a book to say don't do this. It's another thing to actually have a live fire exercise. With that, speaking of live fire exercise, you want to talk about the time you did the research and development?
I would love to talk about the time I did the research and development. So one of the objectives we were tasked with not too long ago was to break into a Fortune 100's research and development facility with the goal of walking out with their quote-unquote secret project, their KFC secret recipe, their Coca-Cola secret recipe, and it was neither of those two companies, by the way, but it was to walk out with this intellectual property. So again, the research and reconnaissance side is very significant, and oftentimes is the make or break success mechanism as to whether or not this is going to work or not. So we had done a great deal of research. We did aerial views using Google Maps to identify the facility, what controls and physical controls that we could just gather from that aerial view. We did the typical drive-by, right? We're going to drive by the organization, see how far we could look in, identify where the security guards are at, fences, all of these different controls that are out there. And throughout that process, one of the things that we identified within this research and development facility was a couple things. First of all, there's a front door and a back door entrance. Both were what we felt at the time was adequately secured. Couldn't get in too far, so we couldn't see. But we most certainly were able to go to the corporate headquarters location, which was on the same campus as the research and development facility. And as we sat in the visitors lobby, what we were able to do was take a sneak picture of the corporate badge. So their corporate badges were easily and readily viewable. So taking pictures and then zooming in and working our Adobe Photoshop magic, we had then gone and created fake badges, right? Just gone out to the internet and used our own badging system. Hey, print me off 2 badges that make it look like I'm an employee. Now those badges actually did nothing, right? They were not functional other than, having some relevance that if I wore this around my neck, it might raise the credibility in my attack. So we actually leveraged myself and another consultant on this physical controls attack against the research and development facility. It was really simple for the most part. We were going to try to piggyback in. That was the goal. And using our newly created fake badges as a driver for allowing whatever individual it was that might let us in to see that we were part of the organization. And the thought was that if consultant 1 got in, then he would go to the front door and let in consultant 2. And if consultant 2 got in, he would go in the back and let in consultant 1. So I was consultant 1, and at the time, this is 5-6 years ago, I realized that in the back of the building there's a smoking section. And all the engineers that were in this research and development facility, very, very often, there was a lot of guys out there, right? So what I determined is I could actually sneak through one of the areas and actually get access to the back area where they were smoking. So at the time, I actually was a smoker. It's been 6 years now. I'm smoke-free. Just had to throw that out there. But at the time, it was relatively simple. I sat out in the back, started to shoot the breeze with a couple of these guys over a cigarette, right? And then had my fake badge hanging from my belt. And as those guys walked in, I followed them in through the back door, and they had propped the door open. Then, as I was about to walk in, I actually got challenged. The guy in front of me was like, you're not a familiar face. He's like, what are you doing here? And I quickly just showed him my fake badge, dropped the CEO's name, and said basically, or the CIO, I believe. I was like, well, I'm working for so-and-so in this pretty crazy project. And that's all it took. Boom, he let me right in. So I proceeded to go to the front door, actually called consultant 2 and was like, I'm in. I was going to open the door for you up front. And so there's security guards up front as well, too, but they think I'm an employee now because I'm coming in from the inside. I prop the door open for him. We sign him in. I guessed him in, and we're both in. Literally about 10 to 15 minutes later, we had gained access to a very, we feel, locked down and a very important environment that could possibly be holding this trade secret that they talked to us about. And after about 20 to 30 minutes of really just pillaging around through this research and development facility, we had found this quote unquote secret project that they were working on, or at least a room where it was dedicated to this secret project. So, long story short, we had gathered all of these different things associated with that project, and our objective was to bring whatever it is that we could find about this project to the CIO's office, who would then bring the CEO into the mix. And that's what we did. We had walked out with like these, they were like almost nuclear kind of nuclear safe briefcases, right? They're just locked down beyond belief. And I can't go into too much detail as what was inside those boxes, but when we put them inside the CIO and CEO's office, it was a jaw drop moment because it was within an hour that we conducted this attack from start to finish. So again, very beneficial. The research and reconnaissance paid off significantly there, as it does everywhere. So that's the research and development story that I have.
So thing one and thing two, take on Heinz and steal the 57 recipes in a Pelican briefcase.
That's about right.
Awesome. So things to do there. One of the things I like about that story is the concept of out of scope for an organization is in scope for the criminals, right? So you touched on it briefly, but when you were first telling me the story, you mentioned, hey, the front desk had these controls, they had check-in lists, they had cameras, make swipe for the badges. They had 2 doors that you had to walk through. They had the man trap, the whole 9 yards. And by the time you got back there to get to the research facility, you had to go through this other set of doors. So all the in-scope things, if you're an auditor and you're like, oh, do you have cameras? Check, you got cameras. Do you got a lock door? Check, you got a lock door. Do you get the check, you got the make swipe. All the in-scope things are not where criminals are going to attack because those controls have been applied. What about the out-of-scope things? Well, where are people smoking cigarettes? Where can you make a friend by sharing a Marlboro and then get thing one and thing two in? So that concept of looking at the areas that are out of scope for you. And the other thing I liked about that is when we think about controls, we think about 3 levels. And most organizations are not even doing level 1, right? So are you doing it? Are you doing the control? Checkbox, yes, we're doing the control. We've got the cameras, we've got the front door, everything. Great. Number 2, are you doing it in a way that's sufficient to meet the risk? And in this case, they were. Many organizations, however, may have got a camera up and it's not really functioning, or got a make swipe that it's easily bypassed. So 1, are you doing it? 2, can it be bypassed by a determined attacker? But 3, where almost no organizations are looking, which is highlighted by this example, is if you're doing it and it's mitigating the risk, where is it going to move the criminal? Because it's automatically going to shift them around, just like flooding a dam, rerouting water to the next step.
Great point. I always say hackers definitely they're like water. They follow the path of least resistance, right? All right, the infamous bank vault story. So again, we were tasked, our objective was not to break into a bank vault, actually. Our task was actually to break into a bank and install either malware or backdoors on the teller machines. All right, so what we had done, this recurring theme is playing over and over again, but significant reconnaissance, huge research. So over the course of about a week, we had watched the specific bank's facility inside and out. We saw it out in the parking lot. I think I actually did some dumpster diving back then too. I haven't done that in a long time. Hopefully never again. But we did. We did all those things, and what we began to identify is we stayed there almost round the clock in the reconnaissance perspective, and what we found was that at 10:30 every single night, cleaning crew came in, right? Typical scenario. This cleaning crew was a third-party contracted resource, and we watched their pattern of activity for about 3 days. So every night I'd show up there at 10:30, watch them go into the building, how long they'd stay there, how many times they walked from inside the building to outside to get their cleaning supplies, all that good stuff. So when we felt as though we had the proper research and attack strategy mapped out, we executed. And so this was not rocket science. This was another piggybacking story, but it's got some more consequential damages. So I piggybacked through the back of one of the cleaning crew members, and I was wearing, it wasn't to the extent of like a full suit and tie, but I was dapper, right? I had my tie on, I had dress pants on, I had all the things that kind of, tricked them into thinking that I was actually an employee. And I believe I had the fake badges at the time too, but they let us in, no questions asked. I probably could have came in my sweatpants and they probably would have opened the door for me anyways. But so we got into the bank, which was only step 1, right? So once we were into the bank itself, we then had to get to the teller machines, and from the teller machines, we then had to actually execute some type of proof of concept in which we proved that we were able to access the teller machines, and not only that, but also get this malware / backdoor installed. So we kind of walked our way around, but the thing I wasn't expecting here was an actual bank employee to be on site at the same time. And so I ran into this woman, this individual, and immediately thought she was going to challenge me about, who the heck are you? What are you doing in my bank at 11 o'clock at night? I quickly jumped at the gun before she even had the opportunity, and convinced her that I was a support engineer that was there to install upgrades on the teller machines. So that was easy to bypass. Next thing you know, I'm installing a backdoor on all of these different machines, proving my point. But then what was interesting is this woman who let me in, or this woman who challenged me initially, she had to get access to the bank vault. She was doing some stuff with the safety deposit boxes, and I still don't know to the day what, but she was going in and out of the vault, in and out of the vault, and then the time that she was out of the vault was like 10, 15, 20 minutes. She would walk upstairs and back. So I took it upon myself to walk into that bank vault, take a nice little selfie behind some open safety deposit boxes, and use that as part of our report. But again, it shows, I think, a lot of different things that could have been done in regards to being able to prevent that attack.
So you took selfies not only in data centers, but also in the bank.
I've taken many selfies.
So some of the things about that is obviously the analog breaks, right? When you get to that teller machine, how are you protecting it? When I think about the cleaning crew, when you first told me this story, it reminded me of a time where one of the breaches I had to deal with was back at the financial services firm, where people came in a half hour before the normal cleaning crew, dressed just like the cleaning crew, with the cart and everything. And they went in and they left with the full cart. And we had video of like people like holding the door open because the cart was real heavy at that point in time. I don't know why they suddenly had so much trash. But what they actually did was they walked around and they had picked up different computers, anything they thought was valuable, and threw them in the trash, put some shredded paper over top of it, and walked out the door.
And some of your employees held the door open for them as they did.
And some of my very gracious employees held the door as we were being robbed. And the thing about that was what saved our bacon was we had really good controls around those machines. We had encrypted hard drives. We had password in the BIOS. So none of those computers had A, any sensitive data, and B, any data that may have been moved onto them was protected. So when I think about your teller machine, I'm thinking the same thing. How can you add some physical controls? How can you add some logical controls? Why were those tellers able to boot up? Was there, any controls that could have been wrapped around the USB drive? Those types of things. And the other thing I think about is, most businesses are 8x5, but obviously most crimes are 24x7. So what additional layers of controls could they put in place, not only for the third party, the cleaning crews, but also just in general for that woman who was there after hours, for the monitoring that could have been put in place, those types of things.
One thing I'll add there is we've heard over the years the importance of the partner, right? Of looking at your partner acquisition links and all of the different other ingress areas into your environment. But that I think also extends to the auxiliary services that are associated with your organization as well, such as cleaning services. Evaluate whether or not it makes better sense. If your organization is really dealing with some sensitive content, it may make better sense to actually use your own employees for such services rather than outsourcing those services. So we can see those pitfalls in security throughout the last year of all the different stories we've seen in the news as well. So just wanted to add that.
Cleaning crews, maintenance crews. I've got a number of different examples. I had a different client that was almost put out of business because they were an accounting firm. And again, cleaning crew, I'm using air quotes for those who can't see me, walked in and just emptied out all their equipment. So the ability to look at those auxiliary services and make sure that the risk is being mitigated and that you've got either strong controls around them or you brought it in-house. But even then. So this example is food services, which is fascinating to me because that's like my entire area of research this coming year is how is food produced, how is it transported, what's the security around it, both logically, ICS, IoT, and also, of course, the people level, which is what we're talking about today. So what happened here, Sean?
Yeah, good point. So this specific large food manufacturer had contracted us to see what we could do in regards to dropping some type of persistent backdoor into the environment, and that would allow us to remotely access their environment and move laterally internally. So the goal was to see if we could, number one, gain access to this relatively locked down facility, and what we might be able to do as far as dropping some type of, persistent backdoor into anywhere that we could. So again, the research and reconnaissance was heavy on this one. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but this is relatively simple as far as getting in the door. It was another piggyback scenario. Again, I hope this reemphasizes the importance for everybody to kind of question if they don't know somebody, ask who they are, what they're doing. But once we got in, we then were actually kind of challenged in finding what we did is we used a Raspberry Pi and configured that in the same way that you might configure a Pony Express or some type of commercially available tool like that. But it was going to just basically poke open a backdoor SSH shell to one of our computers sitting back in our labs environment. And so we had to walk around the environment to find an open jack, an open network jack. You'd think that'd be pretty easy, but we had to put this thing where nobody was going to find it. It had to have power, and it had to be placed in an environment where nobody was going to open this up and say, oh my gosh, what is this device plugged into my network? Well, we chose an audio-visual, there's big auditorium, conference room, this huge auditorium, and we had went to the audio-visual room where they had all this audio-visual gear and just smacked it in there because it looked like it belonged. There's all this kind of rudimentary old hardware and software in there, so we dropped it in there. And then what we had to do was, this was interesting actually, because the first time we set it up, one of the startup scripts that we applied kind of didn't work the right way. So what we did is this other consultant of mine and myself, we dropped this device in this audio-visual area. We walked out of the building into our car, got a mobile access hotspot, logged into our remote labs division to see if we actually had a successful connection. We didn't. So then we had to go piggyback in again. And we did successfully. We got back in there. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, the other consultant is going to laugh if he's on this call. We actually had to request a monitor because we didn't have a monitor VGA hookup. So we asked somebody who looked like they might be able to provide us a monitor. And you can guess, yes, they provided us a monitor, a keyboard. We got our startup script to work, gave the monitor and keyboard back, walked out to the car, had the successful connection, and called it a day. So that was most certainly an interesting story for us. We like telling that story.
It's like take one and take two all over again, right? So I broke in and I put the equipment in the audio visual. And then a half hour later, I go, hi, my name is Sean. I'm here to fix the audio visual equipment. Can you please let me back in? Fantastic. What type of device were you using for that, if you don't mind me asking?
That was a Raspberry Pi that we just configured, I think, with the Pony Express image. They have a open source little image that you can go and apply that to. I think it's Arduinos or Raspberry Pis or whatever it might be. But it's not. It doesn't have to be crazy. I mean, you just need to prove your point. You need SSH access. You can get in there, and then you can basically pivot around and move laterally as much as you want from the comfort of inside your home or inside the labs from your pajamas, so to speak. So we found that that worked sufficiently for us, allowed us to do what we needed to do without spending an arm and a leg, and we were able to prove the point. What was tough was as you probably move forward in the next segue, is how to prevent again such an attack like this, because we have a tiny little device right in a very little small area in the back of the auditorium. But there are things that we can do here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I go to my part, just one other thing about your part, which I think is neat about that is, all right, so you talk about dressing so you blend in. All right, so the dapper IT guy there at 11 o'clock at night. You talk about taking photos of the badge, right? So your badge blends in. You got equipment or a visual representation there. I also like the fact that you're making your equipment blend in. So now I've got equipment that looks like it belongs like in an AV closet. So it's like at every single level, you're camouflaging yourself, your access controls, and the device you plan.
It's not our first rodeo.
I love it. All right, so controls. And I like breaks again, right? So what can we do about that? Network access controls, obviously. You've got to make sure that all the controls are in place, that you can't just plug in. That's pretty standard these days in terms of looking at the MAC layer, looking at the device layer, having the device authenticate to the network. So those controls would help, especially when you're walking around a plant floor or in obvious areas where someone may try and drop something. Then the detective side. So scanning for rogue devices, alerting the security team when they happen. Hey, what is this box? And then I can almost see the guy showing up going, Why is this supposed to be? Well, wait a minute. This is labeled AV equipment. I guess it's supposed to be here in marketing.
Yeah, another good point too is why is this? If you're doing scans or active vulnerability assessments in your network, or even just simple rudimentary asset management, one thing that would pop up into my mind is it was easy enough to know that if you ran a scan against this host, it's sitting on our client DHCP network, so this should be a workstation, but it's exhibiting signs of being a server. It's my first red flag. Why? And then diving into some of the other aspects, like it's running a Linux OS, and we don't run Linux OSs on the endpoints, and this is in an endpoint DHCP pool, so that should be an immediate red flag. Agreed.
Well, that's a simple answer. It's a Linux AV piece of equipment, obviously. Must be the new AV server. I'm sure some executive asked for it. It's all good. One of the other things I liked about this story was, and we see this quite often, is the executive level briefing centers, the executive level conference rooms. You've got very important people meeting with very important people, and what does that mean? That means controls are usually limited in those areas, right? Well, the next good, and that all makes sense, but what happens if I've got senior VP meeting with senior VP and they're arguing over trying to get on the network? So one of the things I always like to think about is, awareness begins at the top. We got to make sure that things absolutely function, business flows smoothly, but also that the executive team is aware of these things and why controls are in place. So flights.
We do have a series of different international airports that are customers of ours, and this is always a very interesting and fun social engineering exercise, especially when it comes to the physical aspects. So what this specific use case is our objective was to validate that the airport's network controls prohibited some of these open network jacks throughout the terminals from having accessibility to the actual airport network. So all those things should have been properly VLAN. So for all of those that have traveled, you've most certainly sat in a terminal waiting area and have looked around, and you may have seen some of these RJ45 jacks just sitting there. And if you're anything like me, you are very curious as to whether those are live or not. And what networks they're attached to. So this is also a concern of one of the airports that we dealt with here. And so they wanted us to go around, and we have access and all the clearance from TSA here as well to see what it is that we might be able to identify from network segmentation or lack of VLAN security controls. So it wasn't hard. We had to walk around and literally just plug in a certain jack, see if the jack was online, then do some network packet capture, see what kind of packet capture information was coming across there, whether or not those were any networks that shouldn't be. Now, for those that are involved in the airline industry or have worked at an international airport, you know that the controls or the networks for the airlines are completely segmented and isolated from those of the actual airport's infrastructure. But what you may not know is the airport's infrastructure has a ton of interesting data points that would be most certainly advantageous in the hands of a malicious attacker. So what we found was that there was an obscure port that was actually behind a series of those chairs that you usually see where people sit, and there was a port back there that we plugged into, and it didn't have the proper VLAN segmentation. So it gave us access to the airport's infrastructure. Well, what's on the airport's infrastructure, we said, and so we could sit there as long as we wanted too, right? Because it was an international airport. It was open 24/7, so we could sit at this one spot. We had power access and everything, and just plug away. And that's what we did. So over the course of about 6 to 8 hours, what we had identified was that we had traversed the network, identified the network segments, gained full access to the entire airport CCTV system, most certainly damaging, right? So we could see every video feed that was being sent to the airport, and that included runway. That also included some of the air traffic control stuff that I won't get into too much detail on. And so one of the interesting components here too is that there's a lot of stuff on those networks, including the luggage carousel systems and the luggage tracking systems. All of those things are incorporated into that network. As we began to poke around in the security camera environment, we identified that there was an entire security network that was dedicated to all of these different security controls. And one of the things we were actually successfully able to gain access to using drumroll, default credentials, was the license plate reader system. So for those that don't know, every time you pull into a major international airport, first thing that happens is your license plates get scanned well before you actually make it to the parking lot. And the goal there is to provide some proactive security awareness as to whether or not we're getting ready for some type of an incident based on a user coming into the airport. So we have full access to that as well too. So we could have shut off the system. We could have done all these bad different things, right? So one of the other things I actually found was, as we were watching these videos, this is kind of an anecdotal kind of note, but as we were watching these camera feeds, what I had identified was that We were also able to listen into some of the network communications going on the walkie-talkies through some different channels that we had access to. And so if somebody pulled up into a parking lot space, that space in the airport was also monitored by video camera systems. And I found this out using this campaign, that if you sit in your car long enough without actually doing something, they're going to raise a red flag and actually issue a security guard to come out there and take a look at why you're sitting in the car for so long. So again, anecdotal kind of side note, but was interesting to me. So again, long story short there, from the VLAN controls and network segmentation, you can imagine what kind of detrimental information that is in the hands of an attacker, right? That's huge. And so it easily prevented for the most part, but hard to detect. That being said, I'll pass it back to you to talk about some of those controls.
Yeah, I like it. So you make yourself at home, put on the earphones, got power, got water, you got the CCTV feed up, so if anyone's coming after you, you got the license plate scanning coming. So if FBI vans are driving through, you got some alerts there. It's good. I've got this mental image of you doing it. I'm going to remember that next time I go flying. So in terms of controls, we already talked about the controls at 3 level. Are you doing it? Yeah, they were doing it. But is it sufficient to address the risk? And this is where this particular control fell down, right? Do they have segmentation? Yes. But is it sufficient segmentation? No, absolutely. Absolutely not. The other thing is awareness training, right? So see something, say something. I'm sure some security guards walked by you. I'm sure some things happened. And I'm sure you had adequately camouflaged everything you're doing. But still having the training and awareness, even in a secure environment like that, someone should have challenged you along the way.
Yeah, one of the great red flags that could have been dictated and disseminated to some of their different people that are on the floor there was, if you see somebody's laptop with a LAN cable plugged into our network port jacks, just feel free to maybe ask them, can I help you with anything? Start there.
Absolutely. But people like to be helpful, right? People don't like to challenge, unless you're like in law. And if you're in law, I suppose then you have to challenge. So if you get this crusty attorney and he's challenging you every step of the way, I don't know if this particular account was crusty, but you mentioned this, what attorney's office that you had to get into this one time.
Yes, this was actually the prosecuting attorney for a large state. What we were tasked with was the state itself that we were working with had maybe some suspicions that there were some information leaks that were going on from a prosecuting attorney's office, and what they wanted to see was how easy was it for somebody to actually break into the prosecuting attorney's office and gain access to some of this very confidential information that could make or break a case, right? The research and reconnaissance wasn't as heavy on this one as some of the others, but what I did was, first of all, identified the state that we were working for, what their business cards look like, and then identified the fact that they do have IT representatives or support personnel that travel to all of these different municipalities and courthouses and all that good stuff and help to provide IT support. So I made myself a fake business card, made it look like I was from the state of X, and that I was an IT support engineer. So I walked into the courthouse or in this municipality and noticed right away that, you get the double glass window doors and there's, somebody there with a gun behind and all this stuff. So it's a little intimidating at first, but again, you play the part. Had the tie on, looked a little dapper, had the backpack with the nerd gear hanging out of it. It was pretty apparent that I was not a threat, that I was kind of there for assistance. So I presented my business card, mentioned to the security guard that I was there to run some upgrades and help troubleshoot a couple computers. And then what the irony was once I was in, it was pretty much I could go wherever I wanted, right? So once you get past that double gated steel door, the sense of trust is that you're on site now, you're on prem, you're good to go. So I had to loiter around a little bit because I didn't have blueprints of the facility. I didn't know where the prosecuting attorney's office was. So I loitered around a little bit, made it kind of look like I was there doing something else. And as I was walking around, I found the prosecuting attorney's office, but he was there. He was in there at the office at the time. So then I had to pretend that I was doing something else, waiting for him to leave his office, right? So it was right around lunchtime, 11:30, if I'm not mistaken, and he got up and he left. I was like, all right, here's my opportunity. He's going to lunch. I'm going to have all the time. It takes me 5 minutes to drop a backdoor on this guy's machine. That's all I need. I walked into his office and sat down at his computer and began to, let's just say, leverage some hardware hacking tasks because he had locked his computer. So I needed to bypass his administrative login, and we use certain tools to do that. So I was in the midst of that when a deputy walked by. And the deputy most certainly, he walked by and he did like a double take. He walked by completely and then like did the backup. He like backed up and was like, "Who are you?" Except he didn't say, "Who are you?" It was much more stern than that. "Who are you and what the heck are you doing?" was basically kind of the response that I got. I tried my best to convince this guy that I was there, showed him my card, showed him all the things, but he was not convinced. And this was a deputy, right? So he let's just say it didn't go well after that. So after I had tried to convince him, he began to make his way into the office and detained me and literally put me in handcuffs and was beginning to explain and read me some rights as we were walking out to his car. And he was literally on his way to put me into the clinker. Fortunately, we do our due diligence. We do our rules of engagement. We get our get out of jail free cards. And here, boy, was it most certainly applicable. But what we did well before this attack was we worked with the sheriff. The sheriff was in on all of these different attacks as well as all of the different major stakeholders throughout. So we had a plan that if I did basically get locked up, that he would be waiting for me there. And sure as heck he was. As I got escorted out, as I was getting ready to get escorted into a car in handcuffs, there was the sheriff there to say, "Wait just a second there, deputy." So that was a fun one. That was a fun one. And I'm happy to say that my record is still squeaky clean. nothing nothing there.
Squeaky clean, squeaky clean. So some defenses. We already talked about see something, say something. Obviously, he nailed that one. The other thing is, I was thinking as you were telling me the story. If you're doing internal red team, bail money. We need bail money in the budget. So some of these organizations that have these security teams having that set up. This was the one where you had a squad of people who went all across the nation, right? And a timed attack. I'm imagining you guys like with the Rolexes, synchronizing the watches, the whole 9 yards, and boarding planes and flying to different parts of the country. And then
It felt very James Bondish. Yes, it did. We did the synchronize of the clock. So you're right. We had an objective from a large, we'll say Fortune 500, Fortune 100 manufacturer. They had a very important intellectual property campaign going on. And so they tasked us with, all right, we've got these 5 major locations spread across the United States. We want you to execute a social engineering attack, physical attack against all of those locations at the same time. And that's just what we did. I'm pretty sure we had about a 90% success rate there. I think everybody got in except one guy. And we had all accomplished what it is that we want to accomplish. But the one guy I do want to tell a quick little story about was, we'll just call him Dan. Worked his way through one of the facilities in California. And what he had done is he made his way through the manufacturing floor to get access to this more executive boardroom area or executive conference room. And no joke, he grabbed a hard hat, like where he found a hard hat, threw a hard hat on, made it look like he was there, that he belonged. He walked through the shop floor, and the controls, the access controls, the physical access controls to get into the office area, they just weren't there, or they were very rudimentary. So Dan was able to just walk right through the manufacturing floor, took his hard hat off after he got into the office area, and then proceeded to sit on an executive meeting in which nobody challenged him or asked him who he was and whether or not he belonged there. So that was a fun one for us too.
yeah, so I think the takeaway from a lot of these things is clothing is not an authentication mechanism, right? If you're dressed dapper, that doesn't mean you're authorized. If you got a hard hat, that doesn't mean, hey, let the people in. Clothing does not authorize folks. Another thing I thought was interesting about this was the bigger the organization, the greater the role of security culture comes into play, right? The ability to think of what we did on the manufacturing side with food safety or manufacturing side with the culture of safety. A lot of organizations are very safety conscious, doing that same thing with security, because at the end of the day, it's not like you're going to have a guard at each one. You're not going to have a sheriff's deputy patrolling each floor. That's just cost prohibitive. So we have to create and inculcate that culture across everyone, across the board. Do you have any final thoughts? So if you were to say one or two things, hey, how would you protect yourself? I mean, obviously you do this all the time.
Yeah, it's for me, it's all about people's intent to do good things, and sometimes as the bad guys, we take advantage of that. So ask yourself whether or not this is something that would be in the best interest of the company, or is it in your best interest? So as you look at a link that's being sent to you by somebody you know or don't know, ask what the repercussions could be if you click on that link. Talk to yourself over and over again about some of those different campaigns and strategies that we just kind of reviewed here, and whether or not that could lend itself to something that could happen in your environment and what your response mechanisms would be. Social engineering is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. All the values and percentage ratios now show that it's one of the most sought after and successful attack vectors that are out there. The human element is easily exposed and capitalized on, and as I mentioned before, these bad guys are like water. That's the path of least resistance right now, hands down. And until we come up with a silver bullet there, this is most certainly something that most organizations should be spending significant and ample time in trying to protect.
That's definitely the number one threat vector. And there's several ways, technology-wise, that you can protect against it. We talked about the anti-lock brakes, and many mechanisms exist to thwart or slow down or redirect the attacker. And then that driver's awareness training. How do you give them the security awareness and assess continuously so that people are getting tighter and tighter and tighter? With that, thanks everyone for joining our webinar today. Thank you, Sean, for coming on and sharing the stories. If you guys want to talk more about this and explore what these types of attacks might look like in your organization or how you could defend against these types of attacks in your organization, reach out. There's an email address in the slides, CBI Security Strategists at cbihome.com. We'll be happy to reach out and share more war stories and talk about ways to keep Sean away from you. Moral story today: beware of thing one and thing two. Guard your hard hats. Have bail money. Did I miss anything, Sean?
No, I think that's about it. I gotta make sure to talk to my manager after this and make sure we have the appropriate bail money budget baked into our 2016 budget. So thanks for that reminder, and thanks for everybody for joining this. Really a pleasure to share some of these stories with everybody.
Thanks so much.